Karen was still one of the few friends who would now come around to the house. She was still supportive and would even tolerate John's behaviour. She would often invite him over to her apartment for a drink or lunch, sometimes for an evening. She was understanding and she was very kind. The truth behind it was so that Kurt and Max could have a break themselves. She was beginning to realize that the strain that it was putting on everyone in the house. Even she was finding John's company difficult to take, as he would occasionally become angry with her for no reason. She understood that he was ill, but she was not a well person herself and found that he was sometimes too much to take, especially if she wasn't feeling very well herself. Also, John had fallen back into his old habits. He was drinking too much, but also he had persuaded 2 doctors in the town to provide him with a variety of medication. There was also a local dentist, a middle-aged woman called Sylvie, who had developed a friendship with John. A friendship that was not the healthiest of relationships, given that John was gay, and also that in his present state he was very vulnerable. Why this relationship had developed was beyond Max. Kurt didn't appear to care, as he was now growing more and more distant and spent much of his time locked in the spare bedroom playing with his computer games. To Max, the relationship was toxic. It was not that he had any personal objections to her. He wasn't jealous. And like Kurt, he was happy for the space to himself. But John had found a new friend. There was nothing wrong with that. She, on the other hand, seemed to think that for some reason John had forgotten that he was gay and that he had fallen in love with her. Perhaps John had turned straight. Perhaps it was possible. Max doubted it, but still the relationship developed. He even talked to Karen about it, as she had introduced them both. Karen too was concerned about it. She had warned Max about her friend. Her friend was unstable and perhaps even neurotic. Karen got on well with her and had known her for a few years, but she had always kept her at arm's length. They were friends, but not close friends. The idea of Sylvie and John having a relationship seemed to Karen a disaster waiting to happen. And one evening it nearly did. John had been invited around to this woman's apartment for the evening. There was nothing wrong with that, and John was not a child. Whatever problems he had, he was an adult after all, and could make his own friends. It was late at night, and Max was asleep in his bed when the phone rang. John had fallen. His friend didn't know what to do. She was drunk. They had both been partying on her second-floor balcony, and John had fallen over the barrier. Max immediately got dressed. He found Kurt still playing one of his computer games in the spare bedroom and told him what had happened. They agreed that Max should take his car and go around to the apartment, as it was in the center of Tavern, so it shouldn't take long to get there. Max was furious. How could she let this happen to John? She knew that any fall could be fatal if he hit his head. She had been so drunk that she hadn't even checked him. He could have been lying dead for all she cared. It only took a small hit to his skull, and he would either be dead or back in the hospital in a coma. How could she let this happen? Max said to himself as he backed the car out of the drive and into the road. He pushed his foot hard down on the accelerator and the car sped off towards the town centre. Max arrived outside the apartment and after getting out of the car pressed the doorbell. Sylvie appeared with a shot glass in her hand and grinned at him. She pushed open the door and Max went into the short entrance hall. "John," she cried, "your mother's here." A short staircase led up to the lounge. Sylvie closed the door and followed him. John was sitting on the sofa at the side of a long lounge. The balcony doors were still open and he was clutching his arm. He looked up at him as he entered. Sylvie followed him and then stood opposite the sofa taking a drink from a glass. "Are you okay?" asked Max, bending down and looking at John. "I've hurt my arm," he replied. For Max, the important thing was his head. He carefully stroked John's hair back, but there appeared to be no damage. At least there was no blood. John had fallen from the balcony onto a soft area of grass just below. He had been relaxed because he was drunk again, and although he had fallen heavily on his arm, he wasn't hurt too badly. He had been lucky, very lucky. Max bent down and felt his arm. "Does it hurt?" he asked John. John nodded. "You'd better take him home," said Sylvie sarcastically. Max ignored her. Inside himself, he thought he would like to punch her for allowing this to happen. But John was his priority. Punching her would only wait for some other time. He helped John stand, and his arm was clearly painful. His arm was one thing, but a hit on his head was another. His skull was still weak, although it had been a few weeks. But any hard blow, and it could have broken the bone scap, and the results would have been disastrous. He helped John down the stairs and into the car. John was clearly in pain, and he could see that he would need to see a doctor in the morning. He would find it difficult to sleep tonight. Sylvie came out and handed Max a syringe and a small glass bottle. Max took it and then looked down at it. He looked back at Sylvie. "What is this?" he asked, confused. "It's a painkiller. I use it with teeth extraction. It will numb the pain," she said, sounding, or at least trying to sound, sympathetic for the first time. "Thanks," replied Max, taking them and putting them in his pocket. Once John was comfortable, he started the car and drove back through the streets to Vernon towards the house. Next to him in the passenger seat, John groaned. Max was still furious. Kurt would be furious. John's stupidity had nearly got him killed. What was wrong with him? Why had he done something like that? Beside him, John groaned again with each turn of the car. He would need to see the doctor. A hurt arm was easy to fix, but a hurt brain was something else. John was not right. He was not thinking clearly. He was becoming out of control, and that was something truly worrying. When they got home, Kurt had gone to bed. Max was noticing that week by week he and John were growing distant. He didn't really understand it. He didn't really understand their relationship anyway. For the time being, he and John stood in the kitchen. "Sylvie gave me this," said Max, pulling out the syringe and bottle from his pocket. "What is it?" he asked. John took the bottle and looked at the label. "It's a painkiller," he said. "You inject it here into the muscle." With that, he took the syringe and pushed it into the top of the bottle. Gradually, he drew some of it out into the syringe. Taking it in his left hand, he pushed the syringe into his shoulder and squeezed the liquid into his body. Max was shocked for a moment that John knew exactly how to inject himself. He had done this before. What else had this bitch given him? He thought to himself. John put the syringe down on the kitchen table and eased his shoulder in a round motion. "Ah, that feels better," he said. As he stood and let the liquid take effect and the pain begin to ease, he looked over at Max. "Get me a beer out of the fridge, will you, darling?" he said. Max walked over to the fridge and found 2 cans of beer on the shelf. He handed one to John and then went back to where he was at the corner of the kitchen. The room was lit by a fluorescent light and the place appeared harsh and unfriendly. As he drank his beer, he looked over at his friend. He was not the person he knew. He was not the person that he had met all those months ago and had given up his life in Britain to be with. He was someone who still looked the same, but was different. He was someone who he thought that taking drugs like sweets was going to help him, to make him feel better, but it was not. John was not a drunkard. He was not an alcoholic. He was not a drug addict. But he was lost. He was lost. And he was finding a way to hide himself from the world. He was someone who was out of control and had left the real world behind him. What was happening to him was that he was trying to create a world where he was eternally happy, where it was party time all of the time, where he was the center of attention, where he was liked, even loved, where the pain of the outside world had gone away. Max could see as he stood in the corner of the room that John was desperately trying to escape from a life that he could not bear, that he could not live in, that he was afraid. He wasn't that he was frightened to die, he was frightened to live. Karen's relationship with the three of them was becoming strained. Gone was the easy lifestyle, the meals, the fun, and the friendship. John was the cause of all this. She had a relationship with Kurt and she had a relationship with Max. Her relationship with John was becoming difficult. After one afternoon, she phoned Max and invited him to lunch. She was paying. After going to her apartment in the center of Tavern, they decided they would go for a drink and something to eat at the Gambrinus, which was a well-known cafe in the center of town. It was only a quick walk from her place to the cafe. As she and Max sat at the table close to the window with their drinks in front of them, Max realized that she was in a mood to talk. You know, Kurt is thinking of moving out of Mosselstraat, she said, sounding serious. Max looked at her. No, I didn't, he said. But he was not really surprised. He had noticed that Kurt and John were not getting on. Kurt had always been quiet and not really talkative, but now in the house the atmosphere was becoming tense. Kurt spent most of his time playing computer games and would only come out into the main part of the house to eat. Even when the three of them were sitting around the table, neither he nor John would actually talk. In fact, most meals were now conducted in silence. John would cook the meal, Kurt would come in, eat, and then as soon as he had finished would go back into the spare bedroom. John didn't appear to know about this, or perhaps he didn't care. He was living in his own world now, separate from anything around him. It was one of John's traits that he never understood other people's feelings. It didn't appear to him that some of the things that he said would upset Kurt. It didn't occur to him. Max was beginning to realize that John had no concept of his own relationship with other people. They were only there to be with him when he wanted them to be there. Kurt was being thrown away, discarded. He couldn't see the pain and the hurt in Kurt. This was John's curse. This was his illness. In the end, it would be his loss. Yes, replied Karen. Also, he is taking antidepressants. He told me the other night, when he was around at my place, his family think he should move out for his health. His brother is looking for a place for him over by his family, over in Aalst. When is he moving out? Asked Max. Karen shook her head. I don't know. When he finds somewhere else to live, she replied. I'm not really surprised, replied Max. I thought it was coming. Why don't you move out? Asked Karen. There is nothing here for you. You don't owe John anything. Max took a drink. Lunch had arrived and he was now looking down at a small plate of pasta. Karen was having a salad. He took a fork and started to pick at the meal in front of him. I don't know, said Max. I think it's because what is happening to John is not John's fault. He isn't to blame. He's ill. So how can I walk away? Karen leaned over and touched his arm. He isn't your responsibility. Why should you give up your life, your happiness for him? Why? You deserve more. I know, said Max, now sounding sad. It's just that if I leave him, who will be left? Who will be there for him? No one. There is no one. He has no family, he has no real friends apart from us. He would be all on his own, alone. I, I, I couldn't do that to him. Why not? Asked Karen, now starting to eat her salad. You deserve a life as well. You can make your own way. You don't have to stay. Why should you? There is Wharton for a start, he said, now eating his pasta. Where would he go? Then there is John. Where would he go? Why do you care? Asked Karen, now appearing to be agitated, even angry. Max shrugged. Because I promised him. Promise what? She said, her voice now rising. You don't know me, Max. You have your own life. Promised him? Promised him what? That I would never leave him, said Max in a quiet voice. I promised that I would never leave him. I can't leave him. He would be alone, Karen, all alone. No one deserves that. Everyone in his life has left him. Just because he's ill, you think I should just walk away? He stopped and looked up at her from his meal. I can't do that. I won't do that, Max said.